morning, Brittany. How are you?
Good morning. I'm fine. Thank you for having me today. So happy to be
I'm
here.
so happy that you're here and so happy that your group and Chloe and all the super Brana and all the super awesome people we've been working with to make this happen. And we had to wait a little bit, right? I mean,
Yes,
there was a little bit of
yes.
scheduling. It's always the case, but I appreciate you being here for sure. Yeah. And I'm excited because the area of your expertise I think is an extremely important area, given the type of work and the things that you focus on. It's something that I don't know a ton about, so I
Mhm.
always love it when I have an opportunity to get educated by a guest and learn,
Right.
more about what they have in terms of their expertise. We've certainly had a lot of folks recently on the show talk a lot about employment rights and especially as it pertains to women. So that's a part of what you do, but not all of what you do.
Mhm.
So I'm excited to kind of dig into all of this with you. So Brittany, thanks again for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Excited
Yeah.
to
So
get to it.
awesome. Yeah, so we're speaking with Brittany Stevens, who is an employment attorney, and I won't do a great job of introducing you, so maybe you just take 2 or 3 minutes to introduce yourself, Brittany.
Sure. So I am a partner at Phillips Associates. We handle employee side employment discrimination. So we represent employees who have been terminated based on a protected class. So, for example, based on their race, their national
Mhm,
origin, their religion,
mhm,
their age, disability, or suffered some kind of hostile work environment or retaliated against. I also handle a lot of sexual harassment matters. And we are solely an employee
mm,
focused law firm. So I think that's incredibly special because we never have conflicts, we never represent the employer,
right.
and we do good work.
That's good. Yeah, well, it sounds like you do great work, strong work, as I like to say. So
Yes.
that's really great. And you kind of hit on three things there. I think harassment, discrimination, retaliation, right?
Hmm.
And I'm sure the retaliation is probably extremely sensitive, but all of what you're doing is very sensitive. What drew you to sort of that idea of employment law? I know when you come out of law school or when you're L2, L3, you're really kind of thinking about the experiences and the mentors that you've had, but what shaped you and your desire to go into this particular area of law?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like the law has always been in my blood a little bit. I come from,
Mm,
like, a family of lawyers. Both my parents were lawyers.
okay.
I kind of saw firsthand, especially by watching my father, who's a personal injury attorney, like,
Mhm,
the impact that lawyers can make on an individual,
mhm,
and a person that's really has a need.
mhm,
I was lucky enough when I was in law school to have landed an internship, in employment discrimination,
mm,
and, it was immediate for me. I knew that I wanted to, do this kind of impactful work. I saw firsthand how, people really needed help finding their voices.
mm,
And a lot of people, at work were just not knowing, who to complain to, how
mm,
to get the help that they needed. And this internship, it was a small firm in Manhattan. They threw me in. I was doing like brief work, motion work. Um, and I was just, I was excited. And it was the first time where I was like very excited
mm.
about going into the workforce and, like, making a difference. So I really credit that internship, and then obviously, um, when I graduated from law school, I knew I wanted to do employment discrimination, but, you never
Mm,
know if you kinda have to just take the first job you get.
right.
I got fortunate enough to actually get my current job, right? And I
Mm,
I started off as a per diem here. Um, I was doing sort of like assignments here and there, and eventually I became an associate, and then I worked my way up to like a lead attorney, and now I'm a
mm,
partner.
mm.
So it really just goes to show, like, when you're passionate about something, and you love what you're doing, and you feel, fulfilled, you can really, like, grow, at the firm that you're at.
I love that you were thrown into the deep end as an intern at this small law firm. I mean, that I'm sure maybe the size of it had something to do with that, but that sounds like an opportunity that maybe at the time was a little overwhelming, but probably really served you well ultimately, I guess.
I That's exactly right. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's, being able to, like, draft these, like, huge motions when you really
Mm,
are, like, just learning how to do legal research and writing is, like, a
yeah.
very valuable experience.
I love that. I love that. Pretty over the course of my career, I've certainly, 26 years or so I've been out in the workforce. I've had a couple situations where I've seen, within my own organizations, the power dynamic in the workplace and how that complicates things. And I
Right.
certainly was part, unfortunately, of two separate situations where I was called in to be interviewed and witnessed to things. Um, it's hard, right? It's scary. It's something that you don't understand necessarily, the idea of consent, but you're being told, "Hey, you may
Mhm,
have witnessed something. Did you
mhm.
witness something?" And then, of course, the victims also feeling that the power dynamic is something they just can't understand, right?
Right.
Or complicates. How do you approach that with, there's this distance between what I agree to do versus what I'm coerced to do, and that's so complicated, Brittany. I really admire that. That's something you probably think a lot about every day.
Yes, it's very complicated, right?
Yeah.
Because, like, the law isn't, we're not there in the law where we can really figure out, like, what is always consent and what's not consent,
Mm,
right? And the power dynamic really plays a big part in, what may even be deemed consent or not.
mm,
Um, you know, these power dynamics are really, like, at the heart of so many issues at the workplace. And a lot of people feel compelled to maybe, like, go along with things, because it's their boss.
right.
And these are the people that are paying them every week. These are the
Hmm.
people that have the ability to promote them or
Hmm.
demote them. These are the people that could, ruin their reputation in
Mm,
the industry.
hmm.
So it's not always so easy as just, saying no.
Hmm.
There's so many factors as to why people go along with things or
Sure.
why people are not really able to just outright say no. There's also a term we use in the legal field where we call it, like, quid pro quo sexual
Sure.
harassment.
Hmm.
Um, you know, I'll give you a raise if you go out on a date
Do
with
this. Yeah.
me,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And, to some people it may seem like, well, why don't you just say no, right?
Right.
But to a lot of people it's really not that easy when
Hmm.
the employer has so much control over the employee.
Absolutely. And again, I think back to the two occasions in my career where I was called in as a witness and had to give testimony. Um, and you talk about these barriers, right? The emotional, the professional, all of these barriers. So, as a colleague, right, or as a friend, or somebody within HR, what can we do to better support someone who might be experiencing either harassment or retaliation? Should we just keep our nose out of it and stay silent? It's again, how do you advise in those situations?
Right. So I think if you're talking about, like, a friend or an employee, a lot of times people want someone to listen to them, and to be like a good support system. It's a
Mm,
very isolating experience getting discriminated against at work, and
yeah.
having someone that you can talk to in real time is, like, very powerful.
Mm,
It's also really nice to know that these people may be a witness for them, right?
yeah.
So when you do complain, the employer is going to do an investigation, hopefully. And, to be able to say, well, I know that, this employee saw some of this, or
Sure.
be able to even say, I spoke to this other person in real time. So maybe they didn't actually witness the sexual harassment or discrimination, but I spoke to them immediately thereafter. And even that's like a very powerful witness statement still, right? Because
Mhm.
they saw the person that was getting harassed, their state of mind. Maybe they were emotional or crying, and all of these, like, pieces can be put into the puzzle.
Mm,
So, really being able to help the person that's getting harassed by being a
yeah.
witness is significant. As far as the HR department, um, I think giving the employees the information on how to complain
Right.
is the first step. A lot of people just don't know where to go.
Mm,
They don't even know that you can go to HR or that you can
right.
talk to your manager or your supervisor.
Mm,
So providing like the avenue for the complaint process, and making that well known to them and how to go about the process, is important, but
mm,
also making sure that they inform the person that's going to be complaining that look, this is going to be confidential, this is going to be a
yeah.
private investigation, and we will not retaliate against you, because a lot
Right.
of people, that's their biggest concern about complaining, and
Mhm,
at all,
mm,
is like, well, what's going to happen to me if I do
mhm,
come forward?
mhm. And when you get to that point and say, okay, I'm in a bad situation and I
Mhm.
need to do something about this. It's like you said, I maybe will turn to a colleague and say something to my colleague, a trusted colleague, or I'm going to go to HR, or maybe I'm going to call you. Right? I'm gonna
Mhm.
find you online. I'm gonna call you. What's what are there certain steps you advise people to kind of take first, second, third in terms of protecting themselves? I know some people's knee-jerk reaction is, "I'm just gonna quit and I'm gonna leave and just
Right,
I have to put this all behind me." But then we know that the abuser's probably gonna do it again, right? So, I mean,
right.
it's how do you break that pattern, I guess, Brittany, would be my question.
Yeah, yeah, and, like, every fact pattern is unique, right? So, like,
Mhm.
what someone does in one situation, it could be very different, and there's not
Sure.
necessarily, like, a right or wrong, way to go about it. Obviously, complaining internally is very powerful, right?
Sure.
Because there's now a documented internal complaint that
Mhm.
this person, is making. But obviously, then, having like an external complaint from a law firm is also very powerful. So a lot of times, our clients will have complained already, and then we sometimes step in. Other times, people are too scared to complain themselves, and they want to hire a law firm to kind of like guide them through that
Yeah,
process of how to
makes sense.
complain internally.
Yeah, that makes
Um,
sense.
so it really depends, but obviously documenting things is of very, very important in the whole
Yeah.
process, right? Because a lot of times discrimination, especially when you're talking about sexual harassment, will
Sure.
be like a she said, he said, or a she
Right.
said, he said, right? So being able to have that, documentation of even just a complaint in real time could be
Mm,
very powerful, evidence to be able to point to the employer, later down the line, especially if you're in litigation,
sure.
to say, like, look, well, maybe there's no direct evidence here of the actual harassment, but this person did complain about it, and
Right.
that's significant.
Is there when you talk about that documentation aspect, right, is there a particular way in which or is it just anything suffices, or are there, like, sort of levels that you kind of advise folks on to really think about?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different things that can be used as evidence. A lot of
Mm,
times we see the obvious, like text messages, right? Or maybe emails. Um, but, we don't always have like a smoking gun here, right? There's
yeah.
not always like, someone who is that obvious, especially when
Mhm.
it's, sexual harassment or any type of discrimination, putting it in writing, like, I don't
Sure.
like you because you're, pregnant, or I'm going to
Right.
fire you because of this. Um, but, like, witness statements are very, very impactful,
Powerful.
and, testimony is evidence when you go into
Mm,
the courtroom, right?
mm.
So, people seem to sometimes, get scared because 'cause they're like, "I have no evidence, I don't have a
Sure.
recording, I don't have anything," but,
Sure.
at the end of the day, you can go into the courtroom, you can testify as to what happened, and your
Mhm.
testimony will be what the jury considers, and, that will be your evidence, and it'll be a matter of, like, credibility, right? Like,
Sure.
do they
Sure.
believe you, or do they believe, the person saying no?
Yeah. I would have to think too that part of what you're doing is making sure that the client, your either active client or potential client, whoever that person may be, kind of stays as safe as possible through this. So, are there indications that you might look for, listen for to say This sounds like a situation where safety is at risk, and then, is law enforcement brought in at that point? Like, where do you kind of
Yeah.
figure out
Yeah.
how to assess something that may be an unsafe situation, Brittany?
Absolutely. I mean, if it's something where they're fearful of their life, right? I mean, at that point, the police is the number one place to call, right? It's not a lawyer. It's call the police because sometimes our cases, we're civil lawyers. Sometimes there's also like a criminal component,
Sure.
particularly if it's like a sexual assault or something,
Mhm.
we deal with a lot of rape cases.
Yeah.
And in those types of matters, our client will call the police and there will be like a criminal proceeding that will be kind of like parallel to our
Yeah.
civil matter.
Sure.
But yes, look, sometimes it doesn't make sense for the employee to remain employed
Mm.
at their job. And what we do a lot of time is, try and get an exit plan for the
Sure.
clients, right? How
Yeah.
do we get you out safely? Does it make sense to just have you quit immediately and we can help you, write a resignation letter? Or does it make sense for us to contact the employer directly and just like try and negotiate a severance package?
Right.
The mental health and the physical safety of the client is like, before anything else.
Yeah, I would appreciate that very much, and it seems like a lot of what you're doing is trying to give that very practical advice to the employee. One of the things I was a little curious about, Brittany, was you mentioned that really you are on the employee side, and that's a big part of what you do. So, are there mechanisms that you personally do to kind of educate people more? I mean, I would think that employers could bring you in, maybe they don't. I'm curious as to how that works so that you're able to help people better understand rights.
Yeah. So, personally myself,
Mhm.
I do a lot of like writing, I do a lot of article writing.
Yes,
And we're putting on like a conference in February for like, informing people of like sexual harassment laws.
I love it.
Um, but I think a lot of it is people call us all the time with
Mhm.
matters that they don't know if they're,
Gotcha.
unlawful activity. So, just being able to speak to people and kind of, while I can't give legal advice, but offer
Right.
just like an ear to them and say,
Mhm.
I'm sorry with what you're going through. I can't help you with like a legal matter, but here are some resources, or here is, what I think you should do next.
Yeah, I appreciate that because I can imagine for many folks, it's a very overwhelming, even just to get to the point where they're willing to pick up the phone and call you,
Right.
right? Means that they've certainly at least come to some sort of understanding that what's happening to them may or may not be lawful, right? Because I know
That's true.
it could take a long time for people to just realize that's what's happening. So I appreciate that. We mentioned earlier too,
Mhm.
when you were talking about sometimes there's no documentation that says I'm going to fire you because you got pregnant. But I do want to
Mhm.
talk about pregnancy rights.
Right.
A lot of this is a podcast dedicated to women, and there are a lot of women that have been on this show that have talked about situations relative to their pursuit of what they want to do and how important it still is for them to have a family in pursuit of what they're trying to do. We know that retaliation exists in the workforce
Mhm.
for women who are pregnant or who are returning from maternity leave. I think sometimes we see it sort of like comedically played out sometimes in like movies or in TV shows, and I don't think that's right. So I am curious as to what does retaliation look like for women as it pertains to returning from maternity leave or saying to their their coworkers, their bosses, "Hey, I am pregnant," because I know that's even a very emotional and sort of scary thing to do.
Right. So, look, retaliation could take many forms for pregnancy. We'll think of the obvious one, right? Like someone tells their employer, I'm pregnant, and then they,
Mm.
get terminated or they get
Okay.
demoted, or, they're given less opportunities than, the non pregnant employees.
Right.
But sometimes it's more subtle than that.
Hmm.
There's this negative, connotation that people who, have families, want more children, they can't perform at the same level of
Mm,
as people who, don't have children.
mhm,
And that's really unfair, right? Because, there should be no difference in performance based on, your decision to grow your family.
mhm,
So sometimes we see, people going through a hostile work environment after they tell their boss that, they're pregnant or they take, some kind of protected leave,
mhm,
comments made to them about, their leave. Um, sometimes we see, missed opportunities or they're
mhm,
no longer on like the path to promotion that they had
right.
once been promised before this leave.
Mhm,
And it's sometimes is, subtle, right?
yeah.
Sometimes there are terminations that happen where it is framed as a reduction in force.
Yes.
Or sometimes, they are just restructuring, right?
Mhm,
That's what we see all the time. The company just
yeah.
points to like, "Oh, we're restructuring," and like, 3
For
people are losing their
right.
job.
Redundancy of positions are eliminated or something, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And, it's our job to kind of like really, you know, pick through that, right? Like,
Mm,
is it an actual reduction in force, right? Is there like 500 people terminated, right? And maybe that makes it more complicated.
sure.
Or is it just like a false, pretense, pretext
Mm,
for saying, really a way to kind of weed out the
yeah.
pregnant women?
Mm. I look at it as like, you know, it's up to the employer really to kinda create that culture, right?
Mhm.
And you hear employers talk all the time about, "Hey, we're a family, and this is, and this is a family environment and family first," and then they, go and lay off 20% of their people because,
Right.
we didn't make our quarterly EBITDA. So are there ways that employees can create cultures, or I should say, Brittany, who have you seen, and you don't need to name names, but what have you seen or who have you seen that have really created cultures that truly support, like, working mothers? Like, what do those examples look like, I guess?
Right, and I
Yeah.
think, flexibility is probably the
Number 1.
number 1,
Yeah.
especially for, working parents with young
Mm,
children. Being able to provide some kind of, like, hybrid work schedule or,
sure.
adjust, and again, it's not saying that they have to work less, but just kind of working with them to be able to, allow these parents to care for their children, while also, maintaining their work schedule.
Mm,
I'd also say, you know, putting more women in, like, leadership roles too, or people, parents in leadership roles, people that understand
mhm,
the dynamic of juggling, your work, but also your family life, because it really does, change things when you become a parent. You can really,
mhm,
like, appreciate, "Okay, I have my, 9 to 5," or whatever it is that you have. "I'm gonna get all my work done during these hours so that I can go home and, be
be with my
mom,
family.
right?
Yep.
Be with my
Mhm,
family."
mhm.
And sometimes, it's hard for other people to understand that, people go home and they're gonna shut their phone off and not think about work, right? They don't wanna be like, emailing at 11 PM while like the
Answering
baby
Slack
is up.
messages. Yeah.
Yeah. But really flexibility is probably like, the most
Key.
significant. Yeah. And that's why we see a lot of people, there's banks now that are mandating like 5 days a week in the office. And like,
Mhm.
I imagine they're gonna see employees sometimes leave.
Right.
And what's gonna happen is they're gonna lose talent. Because people who, top performers may say, you know what? I don't wanna go into the office 5 days a week because I wanna be able to have some, flexibility, and
Mhm.
that may affect, the overall performance of the company ultimately.
It's such a delicate balance, right? Especially when it comes to profitability versus flexibility, and we
Mhm.
see this played out so often, right? It's
It's
so true.
true. It's true.
I I have to say, folks like you, whether and I kind of put all of you in a similar category. So there's law enforcement individuals, there's attorneys like yourself, there's therapists, there's clinicians, there's people who have decided to kind of create their entire professional identity around helping vulnerable people, right? And that's really what you've done, Brittany, right? Is
Yeah.
you've really dedicated your career, and you've done well, right? You just mentioned, getting to partner, but it's gotta be taxing. It's gonna be hard. So, I mean, I'm curious about your community and the people
Mhm.
that help you and support you so that you can do the best work, that you're doing right now to help, and, care for these people who are most vulnerable. Because look, there like we mentioned, there are so many styles or types of law that you could practice, yet you choose to practice a law where the people you are working with are hurt, are vulnerable, are going through heavy stuff. So
Right.
how do you deal with that?
Yeah.
How do you keep your chin up?
Yeah, and, I'd be lying if I said it wasn't, difficult, right? I
Sure.
mean, the work we do on a day-to-day basis is, like, very heavy, and, I have clients all the time who just say to me, like, "I don't know how you do this every day. I've been talking about my case for one day and I'm exhausted." Um, but I try to leave it at the door when I walk into my house.
Mm,
My parents were very good about that, and I
mm.
really wanted to emulate that.
Right.
When they got home, it was all about us kids. They weren't talking about their job, or the stress that they had at their workplace that day.
Mhm,
And I try to do that as well. I
mhm.
get home, my husband and I deal with the kids. That's our focus. Um, and I think that's very, very important because it's very easy to bring your work stress back home with
Oh,
you,
sure. 100%.
right?
Even in the least
Um,
stressful work environment, you can still do it.
exactly. But I love what I do so much that you have to have like empathy.
Mhm,
You have to have, like, compassion to do
mhm.
this type of work. You really have to love it, and you have to,
Yeah.
like, really wanna be able to help people,
Mhm.
because it is exhausting, seeing all of these very difficult things happen to people, and, like, there's not always change happening too, right? Like,
Right.
employers are still doing,
Patterns. Yeah.
the
Yeah.
patterns are still happening.
Mhm,
Employers are still, discriminating against, terminating pregnant women, sexually harassing people.
mhm.
And you would think with like all the attention in the media that people would, maybe stop a little bit, but it's not, people are going to do what they
People
want
are
to do.
people. Yeah,
And companies
absolutely.
are companies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You mentioned a second ago, Brittany, about when I was asking you about, environments where cultures can be truly more supportive of
Mhm.
whether it be working moms or just, these situations in general. And you mentioned women in leadership positions as something that potentially can help ameliorate some of that. You're a woman in a leadership position within your own firm. A lot of the folks that listen to this show are women who are younger, who are trying to kind of embark upon their career. They're trying to figure out, like, do I belong in a leadership position? Do
Mhm.
I not belong in a leadership position? I'm not sure. So not only are you in a leadership position, but again, as we've talked about, in an environment where you're dealing with very heavy work. Um, is there, do sometimes younger attorneys come to you who are women and kind of look for your advice regarding like how do I balance that leadership, my empathy, my resilience? Is that something that you hear?
Yeah, all the time. I mean, I love being able to, like, be a mentor to, like,
Yeah.
some of the more junior attorneys here,
Mm,
and that's why I talk so much about, like, how I started as a per diem, then I became
yeah.
an associate because, like, you can really see, like, the trajectory,
Yeah.
of, like, what you can be, and, I did it firsthand, and, so I love talking to new attorneys about, how I started and where I'm at
Yeah.
right now. Because it's important. It's important for other people to, like, see that and to hear
Sure.
it,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
to know that that's possible.
So you mentioned the mentoring that you do within your
Mhm.
firm. Do you do it outside your firm as well?
Not necessarily. I mean,
Mm.
I have friends who think I'm like their attorney on retainer all the time. They are like any kind of issue they have at work, they call me or, especially at like the phase I'm in my life right now, right? Like a lot of my
Yeah.
friends are pregnant or have
Sure.
young children. So, I've become like the go-to person of like, well, I need this accommodation because I'm pumping at work and my employer isn't, accommodating me.
Supporting
What
that.
do I
Yeah.
do? Supporting that,
Sure.
right? So, like, um, there's just so much going on with, like, just my phase of having young kids that, like, brings me to almost, like, mentor my friends
I get it.
as to, like,
Yeah.
"Here are your rights," you know?
I think some people too just have the impression that, like, if you're a lawyer, then you know all aspects
Yes,
of the law, right? You know,
everything.
and they don't think that, well, no, I'm actually specializing in something very specific called employment law.
Right,
You know, I
right.
can't help you about your neighbor's dog barking at 2 in the morning and what your
Oh my
what
goodness, I can't even
what your
tell
rights are.
you. Yes, how many times people ask me to, like, review their contracts or do something. I'm like, "Well, I can do that, but, like, I really you need someone who specializes in what you need."
Yeah, I try to explain to people the same thing. It's like, you have doctors who are specialists, you have
Right.
lawyers who are specialists, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
It makes a lot of sense. A minute ago, we had said that we hope these patterns would break, but sometimes companies are companies, and despite the fact that these things can become huge news stories and get all over the media and social media, we do see that companies are not breaking these patterns, right? Like you just
Mhm.
said, like companies will be companies. But is there anything about what's happening in terms of workplace equality or workplace justice that you are optimistic about, Brittany, that we say that we can try to lean into?
Yes, I think, like, the fact that more people are speaking
Mm,
out, I think is, very, very impactful, right? Because
mm,
the more people speak out, the more companies will kind of, see this as, okay, we need to make change, right? There's
sure.
obviously things happening here that are not lawful. And we need to figure out how to change the culture within our organization, figure out a way to properly facilitate and help these employees who feel unsafe, create mechanisms, whether it's like, different policies or procedures, or just kind of like offering a safer space for employees.
Mm,
So, I think the more people are speaking out, talking about, what happened to them at work is kind of creating this, change within companies in some ways to kind of even just be more aware of it. And
yeah,
once
yeah.
companies are more aware, then they can start looking internally as to like, well, what can we fix?
Sure. Yeah, sure. Absolutely. And the law can move very quickly, right, as it pertains to employment law. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, it can move
Yeah.
very quickly in some
Yeah.
ways and very slowly in others.
Yeah. So in areas where it does move quickly, and
Mhm.
I'm thinking about like all of this, you mentioned like these return to office mandates and things
Right.
that have happened in the post pandemic world. How do you keep up, Brittany, with the things that are rapidly evolving? And like you said, you are taking the time to write articles to try to inform other people so they understand their rights or what. How are you kind of keeping pace with all of that?
Right. Yes. I mean, it's constant. You always have to be up with the latest amendments to the law,
Right.
the case law that comes out. I mean, there's big decisions that come out, in different departments and different circuits regularly. So, I mean,
Mm,
it's a lot of work just to kind of keep up with what's happening.
sure.
Um, and also, there's different levels of the laws. So you have your federal law, you have your state law, and then you have your city law. So I'm in New York City, and the New York City law is like very favorable to employees.
That's good.
And in many ways, it changes like rapidly, right?
Mm,
So there's new protections that get added.
mm,
So it's really just being on top of it. I mean,
yeah.
I'm like constantly on like, I'm constantly on top of, whether it's BLEs or like, my Lexis, my Westlaw, talking amongst our attorneys here, because you need to be, the best at what you do,
Sure.
right?
Sure.
And to be the best, you have to stay on top of, your research.
And I'm sure your clients demand that of you as well, right? I mean, like
Exactly. They
they're
do.
demanding that of you. Yeah. And you mentioned, you're doing a conference in February to try to help, continue to educate people and those things as well. One thing popped into my head too while you were talking about the city of New York and how it is
Mhm.
favorable to employees. Is there a distribution, Brittany, of the types of cases that you see across like private employees, public employees, municipal employees, or do you just focus in one specific area? I should have asked you that earlier.
So, we focus on mostly everything.
Mm,
Private companies, city employees, we don't necessarily discrimination doesn't discriminate, and that like,
right.
it's within every sector.
Yep.
We're located in the Southern District, but I also practice in the Northern District, which is like the northern part of the states, and the Eastern District, which is like out on Long Island. But yeah, I mean, it's if you're discriminated against,
You're
our firm
discriminated against.
are
Yeah.
and it's something that we feel like we're really able to help with, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily matter where they're employed.
Right. And I guess that makes sense. And even, gosh, even where you're thinking about in New York City, Southern District versus Northern District, there's just so much complexity
Yes,
to given where you are just physically located, relatively
exactly.
to yeah, yeah.
And so much complexity in the law, right? And,
Yeah,
like, the
yeah.
jury pool and,
Yes.
the decisions, the judges, whether there's conservative, more liberal judges. I mean, it's so much of someone's matter may just depend on where they are actually located.
Yeah, yeah, I appreciate that. That's great. Well, we've been speaking with Brittany Stevens, employment attorney. And Brittany, thank you for like educating me on a lot of the policy and advocacy and the work that you're doing to kind of boost awareness, I think is most important, right? In terms of the workplace and beyond and the partnership that you have with employees. But most importantly, thank you for doing this really strong work and really big work. It's not easy. I can't imagine it's easy. I can't imagine some of the things that you have heard and how you then, internalize that and process it and put a plan and an action in place for your clients. I'm sure they're very, very thankful for the work that you do. And we're thankful to have been able to spend some time with you today. So thank you, Brittany.
Oh, thank you for having me, and thank you for listening and, recognizing the work that we do.
You're very welcome. And we hope to speak to you again soon.
Sounds good. Thank you.